Normally, this is when the episode would end, but it's a very special occasion now. It's a very special time of the year where everyone's trying to draft, and there are particular cases we actually need resolved before we actually draft these players. And I certainly can't do that myself. So I am happy to bring on Football Guy's own and my good buddy after a long poker night this past weekend, Drew Davenport. Drew, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm great. I'm glad to hear that we're buddies after that game, because all I remember is every time I hit a card, it was on you. So, and then there was something about Ronda Rousey, but other than that, we don't have to talk about it.
I took a couple bad beats, but we are still friends in life, even though, yes, every time any wrestling matches, I try to enjoy SummerSlam just peacefully, minding my own business at the card table. You would mention is Ronda Rousey wrestling every single minute. And I don't know what else to tell you besides she wrestled one time, Drew. I don't know what else to tell you besides she was on for that 10 minutes and then no, she's actually not going to come back out again.
I tend to take a joke and beat it to death. So apologies. That is me in a nutshell.
I'm sure that won't happen at the expo.
Yeah, no chance.
Not at all. Looking forward to seeing everyone there, by the way. But until then, we are not here to talk about our experience at poker night. We're here to talk about three players individually that have court cases up in the air. And I'm hoping to get an answer here because they matter at certain ADPs. And I want to start with the most recent breaking news and Deshaun Watson, of course, getting the ruling that he's going to get suspended for 6 games. 48 hours later, though, we now have the news that it's going to go instead to Goodell or whoever he appoints to make this ruling as the NFL appeals. So please walk us through this process and what you believe happens next.
Yeah, the process is something that, and I keep cautioning people that we're actually feeling our way through this all together, because the new CBA had this new process in it that was supposed to be an independent process. I'm not really sure why it was written the way it was. I talked with Jordan McNamara, who happens to be a prosecutor, another football guy, and we've talked a little bit about this stuff. The way the CBA was written, it was super vague. You know, if that were a law and it were challenged to an appeals court, it might even be considered unconstitutionally vague. So they did a poor job of writing the stuff in there. They've created this problem on their own, and now they've created another problem because they supposedly have an independent process, but yet that independent process can sort of be trampled by Goodell on appeal. So here we are trying to figure this all out. We're walking through it together. But what's happened is the NFL has filed their appeal. We just got that literally before we came on the air, that they filed the appeal, and that then there will be a chance for Watson's team and the NFLPA to respond and file a brief themselves. And everybody says, well, how long is this appeal process? I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know that definitively, but I would say that it's going to happen fairly quickly before the season starts, that we're going to get an answer on the appeal itself. The problem is, from that point forward, there is a decent chance that Watson's team is then going to run to federal court and file suit for a stay on the execution of the punishment. Now, in the past, they've tried to get into court by basically arguing either antitrust or due process issues. And one of the reasons that I thought that they might not appeal was because the whole point of the new CBA and this new independent process was to avoid some of those arguments and avoid having to run to federal court every time a punishment decision came down. And I thought the NFL might respect that by not appealing, but that's not happened. The NFL appears set to try to trample all over this process and give them a year. So it might end up in a federal court battle, and that's going to be really interesting.
Does this potential back and forth that you're predicting between Watson's side and the NFL mean he could play in week 1, or does that mean he has to continue sitting out beyond week 6?
Yeah, I think it means he could play. And what I look towards is the Ezekiel Elliott case, where he got into federal court, and it took about 10 weeks into the season. I believe we were in week 10 or 11 before Zeke ended up getting his suspension because he withdrew. I think he withdrew a suit in that situation. But they argued back and forth. There was stay on this side, stay on that side, and then punishment reinstated, then punishment stayed. So that could be where we are again. And again, it just blows my mind that all the smart people working for a multi-billion-dollar organization like the NFL couldn't have seen this coming. But maybe it was by design, because again, he gets 6 games, and Judge Robinson, her decision was really buttoned up, and she gave really strong arguments as to why the due process matters here. And the NFL is just trampling all over that right now. So, gosh, I don't know. And let me say one other thing, John, real quick, because what happened last time that they went into federal court was that the court said, "Yeah, you signed a CBA. This is your problem." And I'm not so sure that that's not going to happen again, because this was collectively bargained. The courts don't really want to step in on a collectively bargained issue with a union and just start busting things up. So they may say the same thing again, like, "Hey, sorry, you signed it, you're stuck with it."
Do you think there's a situation, if he does open the year as the starter, that the rug is pulled out from fantasy players and suddenly a ruling comes down post September that after 6 to 10 weeks, Watson is no longer available in season?
I do think that's possible, and that's what I'd be really concerned about, because one of the reasons that I was taking him in bigger tournaments or, best ball, was that I thought that if he got a suspension, he'd be available there for the critical weeks at the end of the season, playoff weeks, things like that. But now it appears that that might be a mistake, because the amount of time it took for us to get the original decision, and then now the appeals process, and then I'm sure federal court's coming. Yeah, this is going to stretch into the season very easily. Now, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, well, it could stretch into 2023." Well, that's possible, but I'm much more concerned about it dropping in the middle of the year. But the more I think about it, perhaps this is the NFL's way to say, "Hey, we were tough and we got more," because they're able to reach an agreement with Watson. I'm wondering if the back channel might come into play here.
I have two versions of the Browns team preview written on the site for everyone. Initially released the Jacoby Brissett all year long version, and then edited it to have the Deshaun Watson is available for or suspended for 6 games version. So both of these exist now. And I'm curious, since we know it matters most to have skin in the game here, with Watson's ADP settling around the 10th, 11th round, is this a situation where you are targeting him? You mentioned earlier drafting him post 6-game suspension immediately for best ball leagues, deep FFPC leagues, or is that an ADP around situation where you're actually avoiding him now?
Now I am. With the appeal, I definitely am, because
Interesting.
yeah, I don't. My problem is I don't know how you stack the team. Then when I'm talking about team, I mean my fantasy team. I don't know how you stack your fantasy team having to invest a 10th or 11th round pick on Watson. I'm not sure that he's going to be that critical for you. Again, I was doing a lot more of it in big tournaments, that kind of thing, like Scott Fish Bowl, stuff like that, and I just don't know that there's value there in the 10th or 11th round. That seems too high to me. There's too many players I still want at that point in the draft to take a chance on a guy that has such an uncertain future. I know it could be great early on, and I know a lot of people like to make the argument that when you win early, it certainly helps your chances. I know that the win rates or playoff rates with early wins in the early part of the fantasy season are important. So I get all the angles there. It's just not for me. I'm a risk averse fantasy drafter for the most part, and that's not for me right now.
Another player that I believe has his ADP being depressed due to a lingering court case and people are uncertain of is Dalvin Cook. Right now, going around the end of the first round, if he's cleared completely, and that's why I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, I believe he should be the 5th overall player off the board and should be argued alongside at least Stephon Diggs and Jamar Chase at that number 5 spot, having seen he's been top 5 in touches per game in each of the last 3 years at the position. And more importantly, we all talk about Kevin O'Connell and coming from the Rand system that led the league in 11 personnel last year, and thus boosting Justin Jefferson as the potential overall wide receiver 1, Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne. But it's also Dalvin Cook, who's quietly averaged 5.1 yards per carry from 11 personnel in his career. And so what now is Dalvin Cook's lingering situation headed into week 1?
Yeah, I like the fantasy implication here that you just brought up about the 11 personnel. Maybe he sees fewer stacked boxes. I think that he's in a position for some positive touchdown regression based on his touches inside the 10 and 5 yard line last year. But beyond that, the legal stuff, I will say this, that the civil cases themselves don't tend to draw the attention of the league. Now, I know that's funny saying that coming off the Watson case, but the civil cases, they generally want these things to play out if there's a lot in controversy here. And what I mean by that is, as soon as this stuff broke and as soon as the plaintiff, Graceland Trimble, his former girlfriend, as soon as she filed suit, Cook pushed back immediately. He filed his own suit in another county, which is another story altogether. But then he also filed a reply saying this is defamatory for X, Y, and Z reasons. And on top of that, this was an abusive relationship from your end. And to that end, she filed her own, Cook filed his own addendum to one of the complaints that had some testimony from his grandmother about the fact that she had been, Graceland Trimble had been abusive towards him. So what I mean is, and the reason I tell you all that is because this is an extremely messy situation. And if we're talking about current legal situations like Watson, Kamara, Cook by far has the lowest risk factor with the legal situation as it stands right now. I've been gobbling up Cook at the end of the first round for a while now. That's still where I'm at. They have set a jury trial date, and I think this is the most important part. They've set a jury trial date for April of 23, stretching into the beginning of May of 23. So I can't see a reason why Cook would want to settle that during this season unless something, were to happen. But I think that this case has the possibility of going to trial, or maybe they settle behind the scenes. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Discovery's still going on, and there's some deadlines coming up in the fall for the case. There's just a lot of civil maneuverings behind the scenes right now. I just don't see it happening until 23.
We see eye to eye as Dalvin Cook is a strong mid to late first rounder, not so much on how many times Ronda Rousey wrestles in one evening. And finally,
you said it, not me.
For Alvin Kamara, that's also, I think, not as sloppy as the Deshaun Watson situation, but the most recent update we have is that yet again, this court case got pushed back to, I believe, September 30th, right?
It's 29th. Yeah, same thing.
29th. Yeah. Okay. So into the season. That's the whole point here. And so right now, where does this case sit in your view? And is this a situation also where we could lose Kamara 3-4 weeks into the season if this case isn't pushed back again?
I think that's possible, but unlikely. So I have some guy on Twitter. I just want to put this information out there because I operate under the belief that you know what I know. There's a guy on Twitter who's a lawyer who says that he's talked to some folks in confidence about the situation, that maybe there's going to be some sort of misdemeanor plea deal on the table. And what I've said all along is that the only way that Kamara can settle this case, because he's kind of painted into a corner just like the state is. And one thing that I've cautioned everybody about is that it's really hard with a victim that suffered this type of injuries to offer a nice deal to these defendants. And on the other hand, it's very difficult for Kamara to take a deal when he knows he's going to get suspended immediately, or if there's jail time involved. So it paints both sides into a corner where it's hard to have a deal. So I don't know about the truth of what this guy's saying on Twitter. It's a random lawyer on Twitter. So let me just say that caveat. But what it brings up is a really important point. There are two factors that I think are complete X factors that we cannot account for. Number one is, why hasn't that video come out yet? And people keep asking me why. And I said, I don't know. But I'm making the analogy back to, if you remember the Tyreek Hill case, we heard some recordings of him and there was some nasty stuff going around. But when the case finally got settled, it was interesting that the NFL said they couldn't get access to any of the information that they wanted or needed to make their decision, because the judge in the case had put a gag order on it and had sealed all the documents from the case. I didn't see that one coming, but that could be something that's going on behind the scenes. I'm not saying that is what happened, but there's a reason we haven't seen the video. I don't know what that is. But if that drops at some point, all bets are off, because we know with the Ray Rice case what happens if something nasty comes out in a video. So that's caveat number one. Number two would be, if Winston comes in and leads the Saints to the playoffs, that's great. Maybe he wants it out past the season. But if the Saints fall apart and they're not a playoff team and there's a nice deal sitting on the table for Kamara, he could end up taking a deal and getting suspended right when we need him the most. And that's towards the end of the year. I'm not sure it's going to happen at the beginning, because that 60-day status tells me that they are working on something, but that maybe it's not going to be resolved by then. I'm not considering that that September 29th date to be super pivotal. Of course, it's important as to which way the case is going to go, but I'm not thinking that it's going to be settled then. So my concern is that it pushes towards the end of the season, and maybe he says, yeah, let's get this over with. We got to deal with no jail time, and let's do it. And then he gets suspended during the fantasy playoffs or something. That's a huge. Those are two huge caveats. It's still a volatile, risky play.
And unfortunately, in these large field best ball tournaments where you have to draft as if you're assuming your pick hits a ceiling. Like, I don't worry about Javonte Williams' floor and perhaps splitting touches with Melvin Gordon for these large field tournaments because we're going for first place. I have to draft him as if he actually sheds Gordon for many backfield touches and then reaches his apex, because that's the kind of archetype player he is. And so that's how I've been treating Kamara as well, thinking, okay, I have to pretend as if none of this matters because he's still a top 12 player if he's available all year. And so that's not the question. I actually want to then ask, are you comfortable at his ADP right now at the second, third round turn in redraft formats, in home leagues? Or is this a situation where you actually want to avoid, thinking it could come, as you mentioned, before the end of the season, any hammer that's laid down?
Yeah, so I think that my philosophy completely switches in that respect. That's a great question, because I tell people this all the time. I'm a risk-averse drafter when it comes to these first couple of rounds. And, I believe it was the great Dwayne McFarland that said, sometimes you want to just draft in these redraft situations as if it's going to be your only team. Like, hey, if it was my only team, what would I do? And I think that's a perfect summation of it. If I was going into a league I really cared about, and I really, knew that this was, hey, it's my home league, it's with my buddies for 20 years, I want the bragging rights, whatever the case may be, I'm not comfortable with that, the end of second, early third round on Kamara.
Okay.
Now, I suppose it's possible that I'd be all right if I went running back, and then came back around in the third and saw Kamara sitting there, and I thought, okay, he's my RB3, then it doesn't crush me too much. But I don't like missing out on all that wide receiver goodness there in the second and third round. So it just doesn't fit for me in the redraft format. I don't want that axe hanging over my head that it could fall at any moment. And I am confident in my opinion about the legal timeline. But at the same time, there are things going on behind the scenes that we have no idea about. So that X factor is something you can't account for. And I think it comes down to your risk tolerance.
He is the great Drew Davenport of Football Guys. Drew, tell everyone what they can find else from you at Football Guys right now.
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of my Mastering the Salary Cap Draft series, formerly Auction Draft, but we've switched the nomenclature over there at Football Guys. So I'm in the middle of that series. It's a 7-part series on Football Guys. And you can find some of my legal ramblings over on TikTok too, Fantasy Football Lawyer, and of course on Twitter, Drew Davenport FF.
And I can attest, the salary articles you do, genuinely the best in the business, and I really do appreciate them. Drew, we'll talk to you next time. See everyone next week.
Thank you, John.